So hopefully you have those here. There's probably some more over here. Yeah, I see there's some more over here. I started putting 8 at the table up front. It didn't work. Okay, I just want to spend some time tonight with you, just kind of updating you on the whole bishop election process. And I'm going to start with a timeline and just kind of give you an overview where we are in the process. And then as we go, I'm sure you may have some questions. So again, everybody try to look at the timeline. So the first section, the Senate Council met in September, and we reviewed the bishop election process. And some of the housekeeping duties we had to do was appoint a bishop election committee. And so we didn't have one at the Senate Council meeting when we met, but Eric Dull is going to be the chair. So Eric's here. And Eric's working on recruiting members for that. So as we go through this timeline, it's going to talk about the Bishop Election Committee in several spots. So the next one, propose and approves overview documents for the bishop election. Again, one of the things I did is I went to the ELCA website and I got the 2016 Bishop Election Toolkit that the Office of the Secretary puts together. It's very comprehensive, and that's where I got a lot of the information that's in this document. In
2016 to 2017.
Yeah, so the 2017 version's coming out real soon. The only difference is the date. So this is pretty accurate. Okay. That document is 64 pages long, so I condensed it down to like 12 for you. Yeah, so. We reviewed the Senate's mission and ministry and made summaries. The deans that shared the cluster meetings, they had a copy that hopefully you saw during those cluster meetings of the mission and ministry statement. It was in there. Then proposed survey questions for the cluster gatherings. One of the things that I did when I developed the cluster agenda was I took the model agenda that was in the Bishop Election Toolkit, and that's what we used to do the cluster meetings. And my experience in North Idaho worked very well. There was lots of energy in that meeting. Then notify congregations roster leaders of the nomination process and the timing. So again, that was part of the cluster meeting where hopefully people who attended got a chance to see this timeline. And the intent is, as we go along, that the next wave of cluster meeting is accepting nominations for bishop candidates. So again, hopefully this document will be part of that, so members who come to those meetings can see this timeline. So, what's happened now is the clusters have met during September and October. The goal was, from the Senate Council, is to try to have all the meetings at the clusters done before the convocation. And then the goal of the Senate Council was to compile all the responses from those cluster meetings so you could see them tonight. And so that's the second document. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But that was the goal, and we came very close to getting all of the documents in. But I'll talk about that a little bit later. Actually, the first two meetings of the Senate Assembly Planning Committee have already occurred. So they met in September, and then they just met again last week. So the Senate Assembly Planning Committee's off and working. And now we're up to the bishop convocation. So on the timeline. So we're up to the current date. After we leave here, then you see there's 3 items on here in November, December, and January where the clusters gather again to present nominees. So that's coming up. And again, that will be coordinated with the cluster deans and the congregations when that meeting will actually occur. So again, it can happen November, December, January. The cluster deans and the Senate Council representatives report nominees to the election committees. So after that meeting, those will be presented to the election committee. Then candidates are asked to accept or decline the nominations. So those 3 items right there, again, when the nominees are presented at the cluster meetings, the Senate Council talked about the process. In the Constitution, what happens is each congregation has 3 votes to vote on the nominees that get presented for the bishop election.
Each cluster.
Each cluster. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so each cluster. So that hasn't been totally nailed down, but the Senate Council recommended that it be the pastor and the voting members from the 2016 Assembly. And I know when North Idaho met, they said, well, why isn't the voting members for 2017? Because they're going to be there. Well, that's not a problem. I don't think it's a hard, fast rule. But the challenge is all the congregation is going to have is they have to get together and elect those voting members. Because most congregations hold their annual meeting the open date or open Sunday before the Super Bowl. And so that pretty much is the end of the timeline. So, again, you'll have to struggle with that decision, but again, you'll have to come up with how those voting members are selected. And there'll be some guidelines or guidance from the Bishop's Election Committee that will come out on that. Let's see. So after, let's see, I think I'll stop on the timeline right now and just kind of mention the questionnaire, the questions that the cluster meetings worked on. So on the timeline here, it talks that this will be presented to the congregations and the clusters. So they will have a copy of this as long as it gets distributed. So that will be the task of the deans to get this word out, or at least have these present when the clusters meet for the nomination process. And I know when I got together, I just made sure there were lots of extra copies because I had no idea who was going to come with material or not. And so I know in our meeting it was good to have all the extra material. So you may want to plan that when you get together. But what this document represents from the cluster meetings is these are the responses from 8 out of 12 clusters. So they got together, they held the cluster meeting, there were 7 questions, and these are the responses compiled for those 7 questions. And so the intent is that these are shared with the potential nominees for bishop, so they understand kind of the pulse from the clusters and what their responses to the 7 questions were. Again, I try to put similar responses together as much as possible. I don't know if I did a good job, but I tried to compile similar themes on these questions. And again, since these are going to be presented, I'm sure, to the people who attended the first cluster meeting, I can't say 100%, I understand some of the responses. So at least they'll see their response on here. Again, read these at your own leisure. I'm not going to go through these tonight one by one. again, the intent is, this gives a good sense for anyone who you're thinking of nominating has to face. So it's kind of an overwhelming position. People are looking for a saint. Or they're looking, again, there's a lot of themes in here that you can tell congregations are looking for help. So you see some of that in here too. So again, that's for you to read. So picking up the timeline again, sort of in the middle of the page, official notice of the assembly is sent to the congregations. That's going to happen around the February timeframe. The assembly registration information is mailed. That's usually towards the end of February. Then the bishop nominees' biographical information is due to the bishop election committee. And in this document, when you page back to page 6, it does have the biographical information form that was in the bishop's toolkit. And I just put it in here. Again, when the bishop election committee gets together, they can review it to see if there's any tweaks, but this is right out of the bishop toolkit. And then on page 7 is the authorization and release for background checks and screening. This will have to be filled out by the nominees too, because there's a requirement for background checks. So that's a couple of the documents behind the timeline. Then the next thing on here, it says the nominees submit roster leader profiles to the Senate office. And again, that is a requirement, and it'll have to be sent in. And then the next thing, nominees develop videos according to the Bishop Election Committee guidelines. So again, the Bishop Election Committee hasn't met yet, and so they will be working on what those guidelines are. And then they'll get them disseminated. So let's see, the next thing, nominees' material is uploaded to the Senate webpage. So we're targeting right around March 17th or mid-March to have that posted to the website. Then there's a kind of a combination here of assembly stuff on the timeline. So the deadlines for resolutions and nominations for a second assembly mailing will be towards the end of March. Registration deadline for the assembly is going to be towards the end of March. Then the second mailing of the assembly materials will happen in early April. And then the cluster meetings meet again for preparing the voting members for the assembly. So when I know we met, again, my cluster is North Idaho, I said this is the first of 3 meetings because there's that requirement if the clusters are really active to get together. And then we're right into the executive committee and the Senate council meets in May, the 19th through the 21st time frame when the assembly is, and then the Senate assembly happens. So that's kind of the timeline. And then once the bishop's elected, then that whole process for the installation, I got to be determined because that really depends upon the presiding bishop's schedule. So that'll have to all be planned and coordinated. And Chris will send me a letter of call for all that. So that's why it's to be determined. It's schedule dependent. So anyway, that's the timeline. I don't know if anybody has any questions on the timeline, because the next thing I want to do is just talk a little bit about the election process. But any questions on the timeline? Okay. So if you turn to page 2, I have a section here called "What does the Senate Constitution say on electing a bishop?" And so S 9.04 is right out of the Senate Constitution. And this is what our Constitution says about electing a bishop. Each cluster may submit up to 3 names of those whom they wish to nominate for the office of bishop, and so submit a written vita for each nominee, so that was the biographical page we looked at, to adhere to the format established by the election committee. Names of said nominees and their vitas shall be published in the voting members' pre-assembly packet, which will occur. So then B, it says 3/4 of the voting or votes cast shall be necessary for an election on the first ballot. So basically 75% majority has to occur. So when there's a potential after the clusters meet, there could be 36 candidates. So there will be no nominees from the floor. That I guess went away in 2010. So again, if you're expecting nominees from the floor, that was removed in 2010 assembly. So that won't happen. So after the first ballot, this is not in this little summary, but the Senate Council voted in the September meeting the top 7 vote nominees, or the top candidates that received the 7 most votes. We are going to have a Q&A session from those top 7 vote receivers. And what will happen is the Bishop Election Committee will work on developing those questions. More likely, it was just at church-wide, the vice presidents kind of had the same format. It'll probably be 3 questions, and they'll have 90 seconds to answer the questions. And the process is kind of drawing out of a hat randomly who gets to start first, and then it kind of rotates to the different candidates, so one doesn't always start. So the Senate Council did decide that that's what they want to do, so they want to hear from the top 7. So then the second ballot will occur after those questions are answered. And then on the second ballot, it has to be 2/3 votes to receive an election. And so again, if that doesn't occur, then it goes to the third ballot. And the third ballot, this is where there will be another opportunity to hear from the top 3 vote receivers. And this is our Constitution, and they will have an opportunity probably there to speak for 5 minutes. Again, the Bishop Election Committee will kind of finalize those rules once they get together. But those opportunities to speak will occur, and then the third ballot will be cast. And there, let's see, what is, the third ballot is 60%. And if someone receives that, there's an election. If they don't, then it goes to the top 2, and then the last ballot number 4 would be simple majority. So that's the process. The most, it could be 4 ballots. Okay, yeah, Chris just said there could be a tie. So there's always ties involved. So if anybody ties, there could be potentially on the first round, the second ballot could have 8 or 9 if there's lots of ties. So that could happen. So anyway, that's what our Constitution says on the election process. And any questions on the election process? It surprise you? You're familiar with it? You read the Constitution? Yes. Okay. Then the next section, the qualification to be a bishop. It's real simple. S 8.11. It says the bishop shall be elected by the Synod Assembly. The bishop shall be a pastor who is an ordained minister of the ELCA. That's it. That's the requirement. So it's wide open. And then the rest of the document, again, if you were in the cluster meetings, I had this information again for your reading. S 8.12 talks about the responsibilities of the bishop. And so I included that document for you to, again, to look at. But again, this is just right out of the Senate Constitution on page 2 and 3. Let's see. And then on page 4 and 5, I included the statement of purpose for the Senate. And again, as nominees are being presented, it's really a good reminder, these sections S 6.01, 2, 3, and so on, for any nominee to look, these are the responsibilities of the Senate. So this is encouraged in the Bishop Election Toolkit to have this information available. So that's what that section's about. Otherwise, page 6 and 7, again, I reviewed those, the nominee form and the background check. And then pages 8 and 9 talk about the protocol for doing background screens and the disclosure information. Again, just so it's got the various processes that occur. So again, that's just for reading. And then on page 10, it's the disclosure form for nominees. And again, this is out of the Bishop Election Toolkit. And again, the election committee will have to review this to see if there's any modifications to this, but this disclosure form will have to be filled out too. Page 11, I talked about Q&A and speeches. This is just kind of an outline of the recommendations from the toolkit on how that process should occur. And again, the Bishop Election Committee is going to have to review this, and they'll come up with the questions for that Q&A. So they'll work on those. And on page 12, if there happens to be any nominee who wants to withdraw, there's a recommended form for a candidate to withdraw from the election process. So those are the key areas that I kind of condensed out of the Bishop Election Toolkit. One of the things I know that's going to occur at the Senate Assembly, the election process, we're going to have Quizdom, the electronic voting machines, so we don't have to work with shuffling papers all around. So that'll make the balloting process much easier. Again, if you're looking at the Bishop Election Toolkit, there's many pages of example ballots in there, so it kind of reduces it when you can use an electronic device. So that's definitely going to occur. But anyway, those are the items I wanted to cover with you tonight. Again, I don't want to keep you here all night, but any questions?
Here, on page 6, the biographical information form nominee, that looks like it's set up to be filled out by the nominee. So if I want to nominate somebody, this is not the form that I use, right?
No, this is what they're going to have to fill out.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, when the clusters meet, they'll bring candidates forward. I'm not exactly sure, it's not defined there's going to be any format for that. Yeah. Other questions? How many of you had a chance to attend the cluster meetings? Okay, good. Yeah, good numbers. So again, hopefully you had a lot of energy at those. And Martin, I think I saw your hand.
Well, the question was raised at the Dean's meeting. I assumed that this biographical form was what a nominator would give to a potential candidate and say, if you're open to being nominated, would you fill this out so that I can bring it with me to the cluster meeting? Is that, I may have made a mistake there, we just want to clarify.
My sense on that is that the hope would be, if you're going to nominate somebody, that they would give their okay. However, that is not constitutionally the way it has to go. What will happen is the Bishop's Election Committee, after those will be nominated, will double check and say, are you willing to stand for your nomination? And then at that point, they will fill out the biographical information.
don't need their vitae or anything.
You don't need their vitae, but the preference is going to be that you do at least have their okay to be on. Yeah.
Yeah, and one thing the Senate Council did discuss in our September meeting is if a nominee does not fill out the paperwork or do the requirements from the Bishop Election Committee, they self-select themselves out, because this will be required.
And that includes the video.
Yeah, the video too, yeah, and the video format, again, it's not determined yet, but again, the Senate will assist the candidates in that process. That's our intent. Again, the Senate Council talked about trying to keep them as standard as possible. So again, if somebody can't travel to Spokane to do the video, then arrangements were discussed at the Senate Council where if it happens to have to be in Boise or Tri-Cities or somewhere else, we set up a process to make it happen. Other questions?
Gary, did I hear you say that we're supposed to hand out the 8-page document to the people who are coming?
Yes, that'll be very important, because I'm assuming when your clusters meet again to nominate, some of the same people will come and they'll want to see this document, because that was a promise, that the compiled responses would be available before that meeting. So I think the intent is to get these done and ready as soon as possible after the convocation. So basically we're a week away from these meetings potentially happening because November's upon us. So the other thing, I did not receive 4 of the 12 clusters. I got 1 more today. And what I'll do after today, don't take this as the final. I will look at the additional responses to see if there's any new things to add to this, and then there'll be the final version.
I guess my question would be, is there anyone that's going to go through it and maybe summarize? For me to hand somebody this 8-page document and then have them think of a person might be a lot of information.
Well, I would be very reluctant to summarize some of this stuff because, again, I compiled this, and there was obviously some people at the cluster meeting that had a passion about some of this stuff, and I think the nominees have to look at this with the sense, this is the sense of the Senate, and if they're willing to do this job, they're going to have all kinds of different perspectives.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I follow up one more question?
Yeah.
Is there any way in which some of these we would have come up twice or 3 times? Some of the responses, or are these just all the individual responses put on the page?
Yes, definitely. Several of these things came up multiple times. So I only listed them once, or if there was a similar theme, like in some sections, communication came up a lot. And so some of the communication comments, I try to cluster those all together so you can get a sense of it. But especially on page 8, the spiritual gifts and leadership attributes of a bishop, a lot of those were mentioned multiple times.
I guess my question would be, I hate to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway.
You want me to put numbers by the number of
Or
times it
something,
was said?
only because,
That is a nightmare.
but my question here would be is you want this to be a document that shares what it is, but it's given equal weight to everything. So if someone only mentioned it once, but it was mentioned 8 times, a person doesn't know which one is actually the priority.
Yeah, I understand, but you're going to see somebody basically said that the Senate needs to fix the portico health insurance, and I think it was responded on 6 of the 7 questions. That was one.
Okay.
Shelley?
It's been raised at our table regarding the video, that if someone's nominated from outside of the synod, how would that would work, or will that just be worked out with the?
Right, yeah, and that certainly can happen, and it certainly could happen during the assembly where the person is not present. And hopefully, again, we'll know that ahead of time, and we'll have to set up phone conference lines, microphones, so the body can hear if they don't come. The video is sort of the same way in our big Senate. We would, if we have candidates that can't come to one central location due to the video, we're going to accommodate that. The same thing would happen from someone outside. We're going to have to figure out where they can go and wherever they are to get a video done. Helga?
As I understand it, the people that can come to the cluster meeting and nominate somebody is the pastor and two voting members, right? Or two people, two other people, two lay people. Is that right?
Yeah, that was the recommendation from the Senate.
Gary, anybody can nominate, but if we have more than 3, then there's only 3 voting members from each congregation.
Yeah.
But anyone can nominate.
Yeah, didn't it?
Yeah,
So
Phil.
at least as how I read the model cluster constitution, and the cluster D constitution that was ratified in 1989, I believe the nominations don't have to come from the 3 voting members. The nominations can come from anybody.
right.
But each congregation gets 3, so the roster leader and 2 lay delegates from each congregation can vote. Plus, the Lutheran organizations within each cluster get a vote. And then in our cluster constitution, ratified in 1989, has a stipulation that says that by majority vote of the cluster, that they can assign another vote to other representatives. And so it can be, so essentially each cluster can determine who gets a vote at that meeting. But the standard is 3 from each congregation plus 1 from each Lutheran organization within the cluster.
Phil,
Yeah.
so, okay, let me check you on that. My understanding is a minimum 2, however many you can actually.
Sure.
However
So 2 lay
many.
delegates plus the roster leaders.
Right,
Yes,
exactly.
that's probably more accurate.
Right, and so anybody can now, it's just like being at a synod assembly, pastors, all those folks have a voice, but in the midst, then when you get to the point of saying who's the cluster going to nominate, then the congregations need to know who their nominating members are at that.
Who the voting members are, yeah.
Excuse me, the voting members, yes.
Right.
Yes.
So my question then, given that as a introduction, is in addition to a pastor and 2 voting members, can a campus minister or a chaplain who are ordained but don't have a congregation, can they vote? Or can they nominate?
Nominate, yes.
Nominate, yes.
Anybody can nominate.
And so the way that we talked about that, and at least in our cluster, is that the campus ministries, they're considered Lutheran organizations within our cluster, so they can have, not only can the campus minister have a vote, but they could bring who's involved with that campus ministry, and then when we're having a conversation a little bit about this at the dean's meeting this morning, and the chaplains are a little bit more complicated because they're not affiliated with the Lutheran organizations per se. And so that's where that other clause in our cluster constitution comes in. So if a cluster has a chaplain in there, they could vote by a majority of the voting members of the cluster to allow the chaplains to have a vote. Or not, I suppose. Would be the way, that, at least if I had a chaplain in my cluster, as dean, that's the way that I would proceed constitutionally. To allow the chaplains to have that vote, because I think that would be important.
Over here. Go ahead. Yeah.
So, as an intern, I know that I don't have a vote. However, I am the representative of my congregation. So does that mean I bring 3 lay people since I need 3 votes?
Well,
Talk to your dean, it's not me.
yeah,
Wait, let's talk.
yeah, again,
Yeah, so I have.
as Phil was mentioning, a lot of these cluster constitutions were ratified in 1989 and probably haven't been looked at again. And so if you don't know what's in those constitutions, you need to contact Kathy Steiner to get a copy. Because Kathy has them. And I have not read all the constitutions. What Phil's mentioning is not part of the model. The model's pretty simple.
Oh, that's not part of the model, that's it.
I think that's what your cluster came up with.
Woo-hoo, go for this cluster.
Yeah. Dave?
And just clarify too, right? Anybody can come to this meeting.
That's right.
Anybody can nominate somebody at a meeting, but just the delegated people to vote are the ones who decide out of the 4,500 nominees that each cluster will bring, which 3 are the best, right?
That's right. Go ahead, Matt.
Am I correct that a cluster does not have to send forward 3, they could send 2, 1, or none, if that cluster doesn't feel like there's anybody that they feel called to nominate, is that true?
That could happen.
Amen.
Yeah, as I was talking with Chris, here's the range of nominees. We could have 1 to 36. Could happen. So are you thoroughly confused? Yeah, so.
I'm going to be going in my presentation over much of the job description of a bishop, so I'll save that till later. But one of the things I want to make sure is this conversation now begins to focus on constitutions and who can vote. This is a call process. It's important that that not get lost amongst all of the processes that we have around constitution, that you are calling a pastor to serve as bishop. It's not in the timeline, but I would strongly encourage you to start having your congregations pray at least monthly, if not weekly, for this process, that the Spirit guide this synod in that process, so that this doesn't get lost as an election process, which, as we're discovering secularly, people are losing confidence in on a regular basis. And if we look like that's what we're doing here, we are not helping the person that will be called. So I do want to, and it is in the toolkit, that this is first and foremost a call process. If you'd like to see the 46-page toolkit, you can go to the Office of the Secretary on the ELCA website, and everyone can download it. Nothing is secret there. It contains far more information than you'll want or need, unless you're on the Elections Committee, and Eric will have it memorized by the time the assembly begins.
Thank you.
The other piece I'll say is, there is not a national standard from the churchwide organization to say this is what you're going to do. I've already received a couple of questions from people in the Synod saying, so what does the churchwide organization say on this? The Synod Council is responsible for establishing the process. And each synod is different. You are one of 5 synods that use a pre-nomination process with no additional names that can be added at the assembly. Most of our synods use the ecclesiastical ballot like we use in the churchwide organization. In the churchwide assembly, there are also pre-identification processes and pre-nomination processes that allow names to be added later. So one of the things that the churchwide representative will need to do is make sure that that person understands your process. Since that's me, I'm learning a lot tonight, so that I'll understand when we get to that point. But I want to go back and remind you that this is a call process and encourage you to begin praying. Some of you to pray whether the Spirit is calling you, others of you to see who is the Spirit calling. But I would really strongly encourage you not to say tonight, well, that's not me. Because my experience, whenever I said that to the Holy Spirit, things happened and the world changed. So I would encourage you to be open to the process and recognize any member on the roster of Word and Sacrament, not Word and Service, Word and Sacrament, is eligible for nomination, including the retired pastors. That usually gets their attention when I say that. But anyone who is on the roster of ministers of Word and Sacrament is eligible. So it is time to begin prayers to begin that process. I'll talk more about the constitutional requirements for and responsibilities of the bishop later. But I did want to add that in since we were getting very process-oriented and may forget who we are and why we're here.
To that point, Chris, can you and Gary walk us through the roster leader profile, its inclusion in the process? Who's going to be able to see it, to whom it has to be submitted, etc.?
The decision on who gets to see it will be determined by the Synod Council or Synod Election Committee process. It is important, I would argue, that a person who has been nominated for bishop look seriously at the roster. It's going to be, by the time this is filled out, there'll be a new name. It'll be the rostered minister profile. But that profile is used in call processes around the church. And I think the election committee will have to determine whether that's only the election committee that sees that or whether that's distributed as part of the information. What parts of it, because parts of it are also confidential, what parts of that then are submitted to the assembly, and that one I'll let the election committee decide.
So any other questions? Okay. So again, that's everything I wanted to cover tonight. And I will be praying for you in your next cluster meetings because it is bringing the nominees forward. And again, more information will come. I've discussed with Eric when he gets his committee together that I will certainly be there to support him in getting all these details worked out. So, anyway, thank you, and have a great time over the next several days learning about the bishop election process, what it takes to be the bishop.